She once said, "If I ever go missing, don't believe a word they say." On April 17th, 2001, Camille Boyd, a black civil rights attorney, vanished after leaving her office in Milwaukee. The next morning, her car was found parked quietly at the edge of Lake Michigan. The driver's door was slightly open. No wallet, no phone, no note. No one has seen her since. There was no crime scene, no body. The case was quickly closed as a presumed suicide chalked up to pressure, burnout, stress. But 12 years later, a high school student discovered an old photograph tucked inside a forgotten locker. The image, faded with time, captured the very last moment Camille was ever seen. And just like that, the story that had been buried for over a decade began to resurface. Camille Boyd wasn't a household name on the national news in 2001, but in Milwaukee, she was one of the most fearless voices in the field of civil rights law, someone who didn't just take the hard cases, but walked straight into the fights most people tried to avoid. Born and raised on the city's impoverished South Side, Camille knew firsthand that the legal system didn't serve everyone equally. In a local interview, she once said, "If no one stands in the gap and says this is wrong, how many more people will keep getting pulled into that cycle?" She lived with her elderly mother, Odessa Boyd, in an aging two-story home on 38th Street. Odessa, a retired elementary school teacher, was the one who kept Camille grounded after long, exhausting days in court. They weren't wealthy. They didn't have the polished veneer of a downtown law firm, but Camille had what so many others respected: integrity, tenacity, and an almost blind faith in the power of truth. Inside her small office, a whiteboard was covered in sticky notes, hearing dates, witness names, leads to follow, and at the top, written in red marker, "Don't let them erase the facts." At the time she went missing, Camille was representing the family of Isaiah Green, a 15-year-old black boy arrested after a scuffle outside a corner store, just hours after being taken to the station. Isaiah was rushed to the ER in a coma with blunt force trauma to the head. The official report claimed he fell in the holding cell, but Camille wasn't buying it. She requested footage from the 5th District Precinct. The response cameras were down for maintenance. She asked for phone logs and internal communication records, all denied. 2 weeks before she disappeared, Camille held a press conference. "We have reason to believe there has been a deliberate cover-up by law enforcement, and I intend to bring the truth to light." That quote aired on the 6 o'clock news. 3 days later, she told her assistant someone had been tailing her after work, but she didn't go to the police, didn't change her routine. She kept working until the night of April 17th, when she left her office for the last time and never came back. Camille wasn't the type to back down. Everyone who worked with her said the same. A former colleague from the Community Lawyers Collective recalled she'd stay up till 3 a.m., rewriting a motion just because she didn't think the argument was strong enough. Camille believed every word on the page could change a life. And for Isaiah Green, lying unresponsive in the ICU, Camille wasn't just a lawyer, she was hope. She visited the hospital every day, spoke with doctors, sat with Isaiah's mother, interviewed classmates, neighbors, anyone who might have seen what happened. She pushed the Milwaukee PD's internal affairs to launch an independent inquiry, but her submission was never officially acknowledged. That's when she started to suspect the Isaiah case was just the surface of something much deeper. 1 week before her disappearance, Camille held a town hall at a local church. There, she shared surveillance footage from the corner store, footage that contradicted everything in the police report. Isaiah hadn't resisted. He'd been shoved against a wall, slammed to the ground, and kicked in the head after he was already down. The clip lasted less than 20 seconds, but the room went silent. Some people walked out, others cried. Afterward, Camille turned to a friend and said, "If I disappear, it's because I got too close." At the time, it sounded like a grim joke, but when Camille vanished, nobody was laughing. A neighbor later told the press she heard a car screech to a stop outside Camille's house that night, followed by a man's raised voice. That testimony never made it into the official report. Another friend said Camille had emailed someone, asking them to back up the Isaiah case files onto an external drive stored out of state, but no such copy was ever found. Years later, a former legal aide revealed on a podcast that Camille kept 2 sets of files for every major case, one for court, and one for the truth documents she held back for safety reasons. That second set has never been recovered. On the evening of April 17th, 2001, Camille Boyd left her office later than usual. Most of her colleagues had already gone. The only light came from the yellow glow of the conference room, casting shadows on the damp sidewalk. Security footage from a store across the street caught her exiting the building, holding a briefcase and a light jacket. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. The timestamp on the footage read, "17 p.m. Camille turned left, headed toward the bus stop on 38th, but she never got on the bus. Another traffic cam later revealed a dark blue taxi pulling up. Camille got in. The cab drove north, turned onto Harbor Drive, the road that leads directly to Lake Michigan. And then, nothing. No more footage, no phone pings, no bank activity, no computer logins. It was as if she'd been erased. The next morning, a jogger found Camille's car parked near the edge of the South Point Pier. The driver's door was slightly ajar, the dome light still on. No wallet, no phone, no documents. The gray briefcase she always carried gone. Her jacket was draped over the back seat. No blood, no signs of struggle, but no footprints either, even though the ground was muddy from overnight rain. Police classified it as an abandoned vehicle. Their preliminary report suggested she may have left voluntarily. That devastated Camille's family. Her mother, Odessa, insisted, "My daughter doesn't quit in the middle." But no criminal investigation was launched. No search party, no home search, no tech forensics, no attempt to find the taxi driver. 3 days later, the case was quietly closed with a note. No evidence of foul play. Possible suicide linked to job stress. The internal file made no mention of the Isaiah Green lawsuit, the very case Camille was pursuing when she vanished. And just like so many missing persons cases without leads, Camille Boyd slowly faded from memory after Camille went missing. Public and media interest surged, but just as quickly. It faded away. In the first few days, a handful of local outlets reported on the case, using vague phrases like mysterious disappearance or possibly voluntary. A local evening news segment even cited an unnamed police source, claiming Camille had recently shown signs of mental exhaustion, despite no medical records or family testimonies to support that. One regional paper went so far as to speculate, could Camille have been running from an impending legal failure, suggesting she wasn't equipped to handle the Isaiah Green case. Camille's family and colleagues pushed back hard, calling the rumors toxic, irresponsible, and laced with gendered and racial bias. Meanwhile, the official investigation stalled. No dive teams were dispatched to the lake. No phone tower data was pulled from the area. And even stranger, the last known vehicle to carry Camille, the dark blue taxi, was never traced. No license plate, no interviews with local cab companies. When an independent journalist requested dispatch records from that night, the Department of Transportation responded, "Data has been overwritten." That might have made sense in 1980, but this was 2001, desperate for answers. Camille's family hired private investigator Henry Calloway, a former NYPD officer who once worked in internal corruption. After a month of digging, Calloway revealed something police never included in their report on the very night Camille disappeared. A South Point Pier resident called 911 to report a loud, aggressive argument and a woman screaming. The call lasted 51 seconds. It was fully logged, but it was never forwarded to dispatch. Internal records later showed the call had been marked as non-urgent. Calloway also found another witness, a postal worker named Latrice Thomas, who claimed that on the morning Camille vanished, she passed near the pier and saw a woman who looked exactly like Camille standing beside a man in a police uniform, according to Latrice. The man was large, wore black gloves, and had his hand tightly gripping the woman's arm as if restraining her. When asked why she didn't come forward sooner, Latrice said, "I was scared. I know that look. That wasn't someone trying to help." Neither Latrice's statement nor the 911 call ever made it into the Milwaukee PD's official case file. When Camille's family petitioned to reopen the case as a criminal investigation, the request was denied due to lack of new legal basis to many. Camille Boyd's disappearance wasn't buried because of a lack of evidence, but because there was too much to hide. The night Camille disappeared. Revisited, April 17th, 2001. Camille Boyd worked late. Her colleagues had left. A dull yellow light from the conference room spilled onto the damp sidewalk. A store security camera captured her walking out of the building, holding a briefcase and a light jacket. It was the last time she was ever seen alive. The footage was time-stamped 8:17 p.m. Camille turned left, heading toward the 38th Street bus stop, but she never boarded the bus. Another clip, later pulled from traffic cams, showed a dark blue taxi pulling up. Camille got in. The cab drove north, turned onto Harbor Drive, the road to Lake Michigan, and that was it. No more footage, no phone pings, no banking activity, no computer access. Camille Boyd vanished like she was erased. The next morning, a jogger found her car parked near South Point Pier. The driver's door was cracked open. The dome light was still on. No wallet, no phone, no papers. The gray briefcase she always carried missing. Her jacket was draped over the back seat. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, but also no footprints in the wet soil, even though it had rained overnight. Police called it an abandoned vehicle. The initial report categorized the case as voluntary departure. Camille's family was stunned. Her mother, Odessa, insisted my daughter doesn't walk away from anything, but no criminal investigation was launched. No search teams, no warrant for her home, no phone or tech analysis, no effort to find the taxi driver. 3 days later, the file was closed with the note, "No clear signs of foul play. Possible suicide due to professional stress." The internal summary made no mention of the Isaiah Green case, the one Camille had been fighting for when she disappeared, and like countless other missing persons cases with no leads. Camille Boyd slowly faded into silence. Time passed. Camille Boyd's case faded in a strange, suffocating silence. No updates, no anniversary tweets. Within Milwaukee's legal community, her name became something unspoken, not because people forgot her, but because remembering only brought helplessness. Her closest allies, those who once marched with her into civil rights courtrooms, slowly left town or declined to speak publicly. Some said it was fear. Others admitted Camille didn't make it out. And we couldn't change that. But Camille's family never gave up. Her mother, Odessa, small-framed and weary-voiced, still attended the yearly vigil, reading the same line each time. "If someone knows what happened, please speak. I don't want revenge. I want the truth." No one ever stepped forward. Only once a crack in the darkness did something surface. An anonymous email was sent to a freelance reporter. It read just 2 lines: "Camille didn't jump in the lake. Ask about the dispatch log, April 17th, Route 42B. When the reporter requested access, the data office replied, "All logs from that year were destroyed under standard procedure. No backups, no internal memos," and then one final eerie thread buried in the classified ads of a local paper in May 2001, less than a month after Camille vanished. A single italicized line. No sender, no contact. The cost of truth is silence. But someone heard. The ad was ignored. No one followed up, but over a decade later, it resurfaced as the quiet clue that reopened the door. When a high school student stumbled across an old, yellowing Polaroid in a locked drawer of a forgotten school locker, a photo that seemed meaningless until it revealed everything Camille had tried to expose, and possibly the place she was last seen. In 2013, nearly 12 years after Camille Boyd vanished, the Milwaukee Police Department launched a cold case unit tasked with reviewing unresolved investigations. Among the new team members was a name the public had never heard before: Area Monroe. Just 28, she had recently transferred from Albany, New York. Following a string of internal probe assignments, Monroe didn't believe in luck. She believed in data, in patience, and in the persistence of forgotten evidence. So when the Camille Boyd file landed on her desk, stuffed into a worn folder barely half an inch thick, Monroe knew immediately this wasn't just another case. The original file was practically empty. A flimsy incident report, a few incomplete witness statements, and a single internal summary concluding no signs of foul play, no crime scene map, no forensic notes, no full witness list. The only thing that caught Monroe's eye was a faint pencil mark in the margin copy of Isaiah G. file sent unconfirmed. She asked records management about the copy. No one could find it. It was as if it had never existed. around the same time. A high school student named Marcus Daniels was helping clean out old lockers when he discovered a sealed envelope stuffed deep behind a wooden panel. Inside was a faded Polaroid photo. It showed a woman standing outside a red brick building, arguing with a uniformed police officer. The photo was low-angled, slightly tilted, but the woman's face was clear. It was Camille Boyd. Marcus had no idea what he was holding, but a supervising teacher called the police after reading the faint handwriting on the back 411 HQ number 9. She's holding the file when Monroe received the image. She cross-referenced every place Camille had visited. HQ number 9 was an internal nickname for an old precinct station, officially shuttered in 2002 and never once mentioned in the original case file. She went to the location. It was a crumbling structure on Milwaukee's west edge. The front gate was sealed, but a side door had long since lost its lock. Inside, dust and silence filled the rooms. On the second floor, Monroe found what appeared to be remnants of an old file room, empty wooden shelves, outlines on the desk where folders once sat. But one detail stood out: an old wall-mounted mailbox labeled, in peeling letters, "Command Room," when contacted. A retired precinct worker named Lewis Crenshaw confirmed he had seen Camille Boyd at HQ number 9 in early April 2001. She had, according to him, put something into the command mailbox. Why did he remember that? Because that was the only time I ever saw a lawyer show up after 6 p.m., and she looked real anxious. That statement shifted everything. Monroe now believed Camille had left behind something critical, possibly documents she hadn't been able to submit in court, or maybe a final message. But if so, who took it, and why had no one ever mentioned her presence at HQ No. 9 that week, digging into former staff records from the old station? Monroe identified a name that raised questions: Lieutenant Harold Vance, head of internal affairs at HQ number 9 from 1997 to 2001. Vance left the force just 2 months after Camille disappeared, moving into private security when Monroe tracked him down for questioning. Vance refused to speak, but she noticed something strange when she mentioned Camille's name. His hand trembled, his eyes darted, as if it was a name he'd heard many times, but never expected to hear again. A week later, Monroe received an unmarked envelope at her office. Inside was a single handwritten note. If you want to know what Camille left in the command mailbox, look for April report code 5111C. But be careful, some files don't disappear by accident. No fingerprints, no postmark. But the handwriting matched that of a former officer named Avery Lyle, a colleague of Vance's, discharged for violations of internal reporting protocol. His personnel file was sealed. Monroe tried to reach him, only to learn that Lyle had died in a car crash back in 2011. Monroe turned to the city's Central Administrative Archive, where old reports were preserved on microfilm after 3 grueling days of combing through reels. She found it dated April 12th, 2001, just days before Camille vanished. The label code 511C, Interim Inventory of Off-System Archives, at the very end of the report. A small note. 1 unclassified item exception code approved by commanders stored at HQ9 Box 7A. Camille had submitted a document to an unofficial channel. It had been logged, then ignored. Who approved it? Why wasn't it mentioned? And more importantly, if someone knew Camille was trying to expose something, did they silence her before she could finish to Monroe? This was no longer a disappearance. It was a burial carried out, methodically, from the inside. In June 2014, the Milwaukee Police Department reopened an internal inquiry after Aria Monroe submitted a preliminary report suggesting that critical files in the Camille Boyd case may have been deliberately suppressed or altered during a closed-door meeting with senior leadership. One name unexpectedly surfaced. In the copy of the handwritten approval form Monroe had uncovered, the initials HV appeared at the bottom of the document tied to mailbox 7A. Only one person in the entire system matched those initials, Harold Vance. It was no coincidence. While reviewing archived complaints from 2000 to 2002, Monroe found a file marked closed, not pursued. It involved an anonymous tip that a commanding officer ordered the destruction of internal records related to an assault in the 5th District holding cell. The report was shut down just 3 days after submission. No follow-up, but the last line scribbled in red ink read, "Camille B. inquired about this." That note had never been disclosed at that point. Monroe knew she could no longer trust internal processes. She contacted Camille's family directly and asked for access to any personal records that might remain. Camille's mother, Odessa, handed over a small box. Inside was Camille's personal journal, most of it torn, faded, and water-damaged with time, but toward the final pages. Monroe found a line written in bold red ink: "If I can't protect Isaiah, then make sure someone does." Below it was a hand-drawn diagram, a web of names, initials, dates, and ranks. At the center was AV Internal Affairs Confidential 2000, likely Avery Lyle, the officer who was later dismissed, but the most shocking was the final name, J.M. Press Directive. The initials matched a former public information officer with the Milwaukee Police. The same man who stood at the podium during the first press conference about Camille's disappearance and declared, "We've found no suspicious evidence at the scene." Monroe no longer had doubts Camille had uncovered an internal protection racket, and someone had stopped her from exposing it. The question was no longer what happened to Camille, but who made sure she couldn't speak. As Monroe retraced Camille's final steps, she realized she was walking a path Camille had already walked, but alone. Former colleagues who had once stayed silent slowly began to talk. One of them, Naomi, had worked as Camille's legal aide, and what she shared next changed everything. About a week before Camille disappeared, Naomi said Camille handed her a USB drive and told her, "If anything happens to me, send this to Janice, a law professor in Chicago." But the next day, a strange man appeared outside Naomi's house. His presence, menacing and unspoken, was enough. Naomi never delivered the drive. Instead, she locked it away and fled Milwaukee within days of Camille's disappearance. Monroe was stunned. She asked to see the USB drive. Miraculously, it still worked. Inside was an encrypted folder, and within that folder, audio files, secret phone recordings Camille had made in the months before she vanished. One of them left Monroe frozen. It was a man's voice, calm, firm, and unmistakably authoritative. "If you keep digging, it won't just be your career buried. That's a promise." Camille didn't respond, but her breath, sharp and shallow on the tape, said everything. The final recording was a voice memo likely meant for herself. Camille said, "I don't know if I'll get the chance to bring all of this to light, but if someone hears this, please keep going. Don't let me disappear for nothing." Monroe sat for hours, listening on repeat, throat tight, eyes burning. Camille wasn't just a name in a folder. She was real, and she had risked everything for the truth. And now, someone had to finish what she started. 1 week after receiving the USB, Monroe presented her findings to a federal prosecutor she once worked with in Albany. He agreed to quietly review the legality of the recordings and urged her to halt her independent investigation. But Monroe refused. She'd come too far. Instead, she made a solo move. She sent a copy of the USB to a veteran investigative journalist, someone who'd been suspended years earlier for exposing corruption inside a federal agency. 2 days later, Monroe got a message. "You're being watched. Don't go anywhere alone." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. She checked her car. The dashcam battery had been removed. Her work calendar had been accessed from an unknown IP. Someone inside the system knew what she was doing and wanted to control how she did it. Then came a broadcast no one expected. A local news segment ran a brief story, barely 2 minutes long, reporting that a leaked internal file may be linked to the 2001 disappearance of civil rights attorney Camille Boyd. That short segment triggered immediate lockdowns inside the Milwaukee Police Department. An anonymous source inside the precinct messaged Monroe. "They've issued a full sweep of reopened case files. They're trying to find the leak." Monroe knew this was the point of no return. And then, on a Monday morning, she arrived at her office to find the door wide open, her desk ransacked, her computer stripped of its hard drive. On the blank monitor screen, someone had typed in bold, uppercase letters, "Stay quiet, not yet." But it was already too late for silence. Camille Boyd had been robbed of her voice, but she left behind evidence, a trail. Now the only question was, who would have the courage to speak up, and who would risk everything to make sure the truth is finally heard? Monroe returned to her office with a clear plan. She would turn over all the evidence she'd uncovered to an independent investigative commission outside the state. But when she tried to log into the department system to retrieve a copy of Camille's case file, her access had been revoked. Every credential locked, every clearance suspended. No official notice. Just a short message from IT order from above temporary security audit. But Monroe was the only one affected. What had once felt like isolation now became undeniable. She was being cut off. She turned to the one person she still trusted, Luis, an old friend and cybersecurity expert who once worked on federal cybercrime cases. With his help, Monroe recovered partial data from her personal computer, which had been stripped of its hard drive. Among the restored files was a short, grainy surveillance clip security footage from outside Naomi's home on the night Camille vanished. The image was blurry, but clear enough. Two men standing beside a black SUV. One of them wore a police uniform. Luis enhanced the frame, pulling a partial license plate. The vehicle was traced to a unit under Milwaukee PD's Special Coordination Division, a car officially decommissioned in 2003. But the transfer log listed the decommission date as May 2001, just 3 weeks after Camille's disappearance. Too perfect, too convenient, for the first time. Monroe faced a possibility she could no longer ignore. If that SUV had been used to follow Camille, or worse, to abduct her, then this wasn't a few bad actors. This was systemic. And Monroe's faith in the institution she'd served for a decade began to shatter. She had always believed in reform, that the system, flawed as it was, could still correct itself. But now, watching evidence erased, whistleblowers silenced, files buried, she finally understood what Camille had written in her journal. When truth becomes the most dangerous thing, justice is no longer the goal. It's the threat. Then came another blow. Strange, sudden, and haunting. Dennis Rocha, a former investigator who had worked the Camille case in its early days, died in a car crash. Official cause: loss of control in the rain. But an anonymous tip to Internal Affairs reported that a black SUV had been tailing Rocha's car for over 3 miles before the accident. No traffic cams, no license match. The report was shelved just like everything else tied to Camille. Monroe was shaken. She could no longer be sure that anyone who touched this case was safe. Those who spoke even in whispers disappeared, withdrew, or were quietly erased. She pulled out Camille's original diagram, the web of names and connections she had mapped in her final days. One name kept surfacing: Lieutenant Gordon Reeves. Reeves had led Internal Affairs. He had once overseen Camille's civil rights cases, including a particularly volatile one involving police brutality. Camille had formally accused him of obstructing evidence collection. The complaint was dismissed within 48 hours. Monroe reached out to a former ethics oversight officer, a retired investigator named Margaret Lutz. At first, Lutz refused to speak, but when Monroe played a clip of Camille's voice, the same, breathless, brave message from the USB, Margaret broke down. She was right, Margaret whispered through tears. I knew, but I stayed silent. Then she told Monroe what no one had ever admitted in March 2001, just weeks before Camille vanished. Camille submitted a 17-page report detailing misconduct by Reeves and several officers, including evidence tampering and witness intimidation. But the report never made it into the system. Lutz said she had received a direct order: destroy the file. The order came from Reeves himself. 1 week later, Camille disappeared. At this point, every thread pointed to a central truth. Camille hadn't just uncovered evidence. She had threatened a structure of power, and that structure responded. Monroe no longer knew whom she could trust. 3 days after Margaret's confession, Monroe received an anonymous email. No subject, no sender, just a file. It was a scanned photo of an evidence inventory slip, dated April 16th, 2001, printed in bold gray leather bag, transferred by direct order. The signature was blacked out, but the upper left corner bore a stamp: Internal Security Division Action Code R42B, the same code Camille had mentioned in her notebook, the same unit Reeves once commanded, the gray leather bag, the one Camille was carrying her last night. Monroe immediately filed a request to trace the last recorded location of evidence item R42B, April 2001, Camille Boyd. 2 days later, she got a reply, no matching storage records. Item may have been destroyed under 5-year disposal policy, but Monroe knew that was just the surface. She met privately with a trusted colleague who told her about an old rumor that a storage annex on the west side of the department, now abandoned, still held overflow evidence boxes deemed low priority. She went alone. Early morning, no warning. The place was dank, moldy, heavy with the scent of rotting paper. She moved shelf by shelf, box by box, until, on the lowest tier of a rusted rack, she saw it, a faded paper label, CBY 2001. Her hands shook as she pulled the box down. Inside was a gray leather bag, caked in dust, the zipper corroded, but intact. Monroe, gloved and trembling, opened it. Inside were folders, dozens, unpublished witness statements, annotated timelines, and at the very bottom, a hardbound notebook. The first page read, "In red ink, if I don't come back, this is why." The next page listed the names Camille had investigated. And in the center of the list, marked with 3 bold red exclamation points, Gordon Reeves. Monroe stood frozen. The bag, thought to be lost for 13 years, had never left the department. It had been hidden, like Camille, like the truth, like justice. And then tucked deep between the notebook pages, a folded parking stub slipped out. A timestamp, April 17th, 2001. Location MPD internal garage basement level. That was the last day Camille was seen alive. And now. Monroe had the proof that she had been inside the police department the night she vanished. The parking stub became the final key, the one that would either unlock the truth or bury it all over again. Monroe brought the ticket to the department's internal garage access unit, asking them to match it with entry data from that day. A senior staffer named Roland stared at the slip and went still. "This is the old type," he said quietly. "We stopped using these after 2003. But when Monroe asked if there was any data archived for April 17th, 2001, Roland hesitated for a long time. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "There's one paper log. I kept it. Don't know why. It's not in the system." From a deep drawer. Roland pulled out a worn printout, a list of 14 license plates logged that day. 2 names were crossed out. One was Camille Boyd's personal vehicle. The other a car registered to Gordon Reeves. Same day, same garage, less than 15 minutes apart. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to freeze Monroe in place. She imagined the final moment, Camille stepping into the underground lot, gray leather bag in hand, maybe to deliver evidence, maybe to confront someone, and someone was already waiting. Monroe submitted her findings to the State Judicial Review Board and handed over all remaining materials to the Special Prosecutor's Office. A closed-door meeting followed. No press, no statements, no indictments. When Monroe left the room, the silence clung to her like fog in the elevator, descending toward the basement. She asked herself, is this justice beginning or just another loop where the truth is buried under pending review? The next day, an internal bulletin went out. The State Judicial Review Board is considering opening an independent inquiry related to the Camille Boyd case. No public comment at this time, no press conference, no arrests, no apology. It was like someone had pulled the oxygen from the room again. A few days later, Monroe visited Odessa Boyd, now in her 70s, nearly blind. Odessa still kept Camille's photo on a modest altar near the window. When Monroe told her about the journal, the parking ticket, the name Reeves Odessa nodded slowly. I always knew she didn't just walk away, but I also knew maybe justice would never come. She turned to Monroe and held her hand. "You're the first person in almost 15 years who didn't turn away. Thank you for listening to her when no one else did." Weeks later, a group of law students from the University of Wisconsin hosted a memorial symposium for Camille Boyd at a public library. They printed the old 2001 headline, "Lawyer Missing." No suspects, no leads, and placed it beside pages from Camille's recovered notebook, under the soft glow of yellow lights. More than 50 people gathered, most of them black women, reading, reflecting, as if reaching into a memory no one had dared to name. One of Camille's former students, now a law professor in New Orleans, flew in just to speak. She said, "Camille taught me law wasn't about books. It was about human lives when she disappeared. I stayed silent, out of fear. But today, I will not be silent." The entire room rose in applause, not for performance, but because someone had finally spoken for the woman who had once been buried in silence. Throughout the evening, Camille's name was repeated like breath. People who had never met her left handwritten notes on a board near the exit. "You are not forgotten. Thank you for fighting when no one else would." I was Isaiah. It was no longer just the story of a missing lawyer. It was a story of a community once erased, reclaiming its voice. As for Monroe, she left the department 1 month later, quietly. No statement, no farewell press release, just a single email to a few close colleagues. Justice doesn't always arrive through indictments or trials. Sometimes it arrives when we finally tell the story the right way. Camille deserves that. She relocated to a small town south of Chicago, where she began compiling the full case into an open-source investigative file titled "Camille the Vanishing That Spoke Too Loud." In the introduction, she wrote, "This is not a conclusion. It's the beginning of a conversation we should have had years ago. Camille Boyd wasn't forgotten, she was buried. And now, we are uncovering her page by page, name by name, word by word." 1 year later, the case of Camille Boyd was officially reopened under a federal criminal investigation. No one was arrested, no charges were filed, but at a press conference, a federal official said, "Justice has no expiration date. Silence is no longer an option." When asked if they believed Camille had been murdered, the spokesperson replied, "We're not ruling anything out. But it's clear this was not a random disappearance." And so, as if even time had learned to wait patiently, Camille's story began to echo again, not in clickbait headlines, but in classrooms, in symposiums, in the quiet of late nights, where someone, maybe even you, listens and wonders, if it were me, would I have spoken up like she did? This story has no ending. It continues every time someone chooses to confront injustice. Camille Boyd didn't come back, but her voice never left. Some stories don't need a conclusion. They need to be told carefully, deeply, and long enough for us to remember how long we were silent. Camille Boyd was never found. No verdict was rendered. No stone bears her cause. But she left a scar in the memory of a city, a reminder that even the smallest truth can shake an entire system if we dare to listen. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be an investigator. You don't have to be in the room. You just have to remember, some people stepped into darkness, not because they weren't afraid, but because they believed that if they didn't do it, no one would. So, if you've ever doubted justice, if you've ever felt your community's truth wasn't loud enough to be heard, this story is for you. Camille is part of us, and we, as long as we remember, as long as we speak, as long as we continue, are the part of her that still remains. ChatGPT, C, THMCL, same I.